All right, you guys can pause the video if you need to, because you guys are going to go ahead and take a look at the answers that are here. And the answers in red are the answers we didn't cover last time in notes, and the answers in blue are the ones that we did together. So you'll just want to go ahead and take a look. A couple of things, like in the 45 degree, the tangent equals 1 because rad 2 over 2 divided by rad 2 over 2. Even though that can be very complicated, it is basically just 1 because it is the same number divided by itself. So you guys should be able to see that. So again, just take a look, make sure everything makes sense. Pause if you need to. So then the next thing that we're going to look at is doing some sample problems with this information. All right, so we're going to go through and look at some of these angles. So the first thing we're going to think about is tan 120. And so I'm going to show you guys how I would do them without looking at my unit circle. I understand if you're looking at the unit circle, you guys have the coordinates right there in front of you. But again, remember, the goal is to have the unit circle memorized, so to speak. But when you memorize, you really just want to be looking for patterns. For example, here's basically what I have memorized in my head. And I'm not saying that it's by far the best. I'm just trying to show you, if you guys know enough about me, I probably could not fit that information in my head unless I have it associated with something. So I have 30 degrees and 60 degrees associated with these two numbers, rad 3 over 2 and 1/2, because I know that those show up everywhere. And I have 45 degrees associated with rad 2 over 2. And if it's one of the angles like 90 or something like that, I know to use 1 and 0. That's literally like all that I have memorized. And otherwise, I just kind of picture the position. So when they say 120, 120 would be like right here. Okay. And I know 120 is either a 30 or a 60 just by the number that it is. And so remember, when we draw the triangles, we draw them back to the x-axis. So it really becomes how many degrees are between the angle I'm at and the x-axis, and that's 60. So it's a 60. So I know it's rad 3 over 2 and 1/2. And then sometimes it's difficult for you guys to remember the order. So for me personally, the way that I remember the order is when it's a 60-degree angle like that, it's a shorter x distance and a longer y distance. 1/2 is the shorter number. So this is the 1/2 and this is the rad 3 over 2. So I know it's a 1/2 x, a rad 3 over 2 y. And given that it's in the second quadrant, the 1/2 has to be negative. Once I've figured out that stuff in my head, I have memorized that tangent of any angle is the y coordinate divided by the x coordinate. And now I just use the information from this to figure this out. So the y is rad 3 over 2 divided by the x of negative 1/2. Rad 3 over 2 times the reciprocal of negative 1/2 would equal negative rad 3. So negative rad 3 is my tangent. The next question asks the cosecant of 300. In my head, I'm probably not going to think cosecant. It's a little confusing for me. I'm probably going to think about the sine first. And I'm going to go through the same thing we did originally to find position. So I want to find 300 degrees. I know 300 degrees is almost the whole way around the circle. So it's down here in the fourth quadrant. So it's gone all the way around here. And again, what is this reference angle? This reference angle is 60 because it's 60 degrees away from being the entire circle. And remember, that's a short x and a long y to get to this position. So that's a 1/2 for the x and a rad 3 over 2 for the y. And in the fourth quadrant, the y coordinate would be negative. So the sine would be the y coordinate. The cosecant is going to be the reciprocal of that. And then if I have to, I'm going to rationalize, which I have to in this case, and I get negative 2 rad 3 over 3. All right, cotangent of 270. So again, I want to think about position first. So here's 0. 270 is to this axis right here. So that's a 1, 0. It's on one of the planes. So this would be 0 with x and negative 1 as the y coordinate. Then once I put together the coordinates, remember if tangent is equal to y over x, then cotangent is equal to x over y. So in this case, that would be 0 over negative 1, which would be 0. All right, the next example says the sine of negative 90. So actually, number 4 is coterminal with number 3. So you'll see we're kind of sitting at the same position. Negative 90 would be, here's my initial side. I go 90 degrees in this direction. So I still land at that same position where the coordinates are 0, negative 1. Sine is the y coordinate. So in this case, that will be equal to negative 1. For the cosine of 600 degrees, so 600 is a really large number. I can tell by the number that it's more than one time around the circle. So I'm just going to think to myself for a minute, 600 minus 360 leaves me with 240. So 600 is like 360 and another 240. So I would go 360 degrees, and now I'd go an extra 240 degrees, which is in this third quadrant. 240 degrees is 60 degrees past 180, so it's a 60. And again, that's a shorter x with a longer y. So short x means 1/2 is the x, longer y means rad 3 over 2 is the y, and being in the third quadrant means that both coordinates are negative. And so then I look back at the problem. It asks for the cosine at 600 degrees. Now that I've found my position where 600 degree lands, I need to remember that the cosine on the unit circle can be equivalent to the x coordinate. So in this case, the cosine of 600 is negative 1/2. Then I can look at number 6, which is the secant of 510. So I first need to understand what 510 is. And again, I recognize that as bigger than 360. So I'm going to subtract that. So 510 is 360 plus another 150. So when I think about that, that would be going around 360 degrees and then another 150 degrees, which is here in the second quadrant. 150 degrees is 30 degrees away from 180. So that's a longer x and then a shorter y. So the y is the shorter one in this case. And to be over here in the second quadrant, the x would have to be negative. And now I'm going to look back at the problem now that I understand my position, like where 510 lands, what it's coterminal with, what the coordinates are there. And I see that I'm looking for the secant. Remember, the secant is the reciprocal of the cosine. So I'm not really a big fan of like finding cosine. Or finding secant. I want to find cosine and then understand the reciprocal. So the cosine of 510 would be negative rad 3 over 2 because that's the x coordinate. So the secant will be the reciprocal of that. And again, I will rationalize the denominator. So I get negative 2 rad 3 over 3. All right, for number 7, I have the tangent of negative 150. So the last negative angle that we did was 90, and that was a little bit easier to understand. If you struggle with what negative 150 is, my best advice would be to relate it to the things that you know around the circle, like 180. So when I see a number like 150, I think about how that's 30 degrees away from being 180. So if I'm going in the negative direction from my initial starting point and I'm trying to understand what negative 150 is, I know it's not all the way to 180. So it's over here in the second quadrant. Then you should think to yourself, how far away from 180 is it? It's 30 degrees. So it's a 30-degree reference angle, which is a longer x and a shorter y. So a shorter y means the 1/2 is the y. That means the x is rad 3 over 2. And to be in the third quadrant, they would both be negative. Then I remember that tangent is y divided by x. So I'm going to do the y coordinate divided by the x coordinate, which would be negative 1/2 times the reciprocal of negative rad 3 over 2, which gives me 1 over rad 3. And again, I would want to rationalize the denominator here. So I would get rad 3 over 3. So then I look at number 6, it has negative 405. So again, first recognize that 405 degrees is more than 360. Okay, so I'm going to think 405. I'm going to think about what I have when I take 360 away from that. So that's 45 degrees. So what negative 405 degrees to me means, it means in the negative direction, so make sure you're thinking in the right direction, you go around the circle one entire time and then an extra 45 degrees. So you land right here at 45. And remember, I have my unit circle memorized, and the coordinates that I associate with 45 are the numbers rad 2 over 2, and it's the same because a 45, 45, 90 has the same distance for both the x and the y. And then to be down here in the fourth quadrant, it would have to be a positive x with a negative y. And now I return back to the question. Now that I understand my position, where negative 405 degrees is and what the coordinates are that go with that, I look back at what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the sine. I remember that in the unit circle, the sine can be calculated strictly by using the y coordinate. So in this case, the value will be negative rad 2 over 2. And then the last example here, the cosecant of negative 540. So again, the first thing I want to do is understand the position of negative 540 degrees. And again, I notice that 540 is bigger than 360. So I subtract those. So it's 180 degrees bigger than 360. So negative 540 means to go in the negative direction, 360 degrees, and then an additional 180 degrees. So you land right here on the negative x-axis, same place that you would land if you went 180 degrees. The coordinates there, I know because it's on the axis, I should use ones and zeros. So at that position, it would be negative 1, 0. So I don't actually want to calculate cosecant at first. My head is going to think about sine because those are reciprocals. So I'm first going to look at what the sine of negative 540 is. So at this position on the unit circle, sine is equal to the y coordinate, which is 0. The cosecant would be the reciprocal of that, which is in this case undefined. Okay. So then you're going to be doing work like this, and then your job over spring break is really going to be to make sure you know the unit circle, that you have it memorized. But remember, don't think of it as a bunch of separate pieces of information. Look at how much I showed you that I have. So I really have these numbers memorized and grouped together. And then I do know that the sine is the y, the cosine is the x, and the tangent is y over x. And then I know which words are the reciprocals of those. But so that circle looks like a lot of information, but if you understand all the patterns of how we put it together, you could kind of break it down just to these basic things and be able to do what you need to do. Okay, so work on it over break. Use these examples to help you complete the homework and ask any questions that you need.